Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here as director of the International Agency at UFPR. I just would like to say a few words about the purposes of this meeting and why it's being done in English. And then I will pass the word to Professor Maria Rita, who will be coordinating this session. I'll be in the backstage. So the main reason we have organized this SDG international seminar at the international office is that we think that it is most important that the universities and especially the internationalization offices start taking the SDGs as a focus for the university's development plans. So the idea is to take the SDGs as a guideline for our researchers to develop their plans and for the universities to have a more organized and a more organic approach to the SDGs. We think that the SDGs offer us a plan, an organic plan through which we can better develop our research, through which we can better share our best partners abroad. So it's an interesting opportunity for us to start having a more organic and a more shared interaction with our partners abroad. And this is why we have decided to organize this event entirely in English. We will be starting with Professor Ângela. There has been a slight problem with Professor Elsie Vieira. She is caught up in the traffic going to the Queen Mary University. She's here? Oh, she has just arrived. Perfect. Great. Thank you. Welcome, Professor Elsie. So then I'm just going to the backstage and I'll pass the word to Professor Maria Rita, who will be coordinating this.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone here and listen to us. I would like to welcome Professor Ângela, Professor Sonia, and Professor Elsie. They're going to talk about one of the 14 SDGs, the gender inequality or gender equality, a very important issue that we are going to host in this round table or this section, talking about this thing on this time, on the pandemic times. We all know that the inequality of gender has grown in the whole world, in the pandemic world, and we would really like to listen to our speakers today. And I will start with Professor Ângela. Ângela, is that okay that we start with you? And I'm going to introduce Professor Ângela. Professor Ângela Machado Couto Fonseca is professor at the Federal University of Paraná, Paraná Law School. She has got her PhD in philosophy of law at the Federal University of Paraná, with a doctoral internship period at École des Hautes Études Sociales in Paris. She has experience in philosophy and philosophy of law, with an emphasis of political philosophy, working mainly on the following themes and author: Nietzsche, Foucault, law, nihilism, criticism of modernity, criticism of metaphysics, biopolitics, body, sexuality, and gender. Currently, her research is about the relationship between politics and bodies, When dealing with politics from the perspective of bodies, Ângela Fonseca addresses two dimensions. First one, the concern with the political exercise in the definition and control of over bodies under the notion of politics. And second, a new dimension concerning the performative of political bodies. She addresses debate on constructionism, biopotency, immunity, and more recently, performativity. She published a number of books and articles on body, sexuality, gender, and subjectivity. Ângela, it's with you now, please.
So good morning, everyone. I am very happy to be here. I have to thank very much for the invitation, Professor André Duarte. I'm very happy to be here with Professor Sonia, Professor Elsie, my dear friend Maria Rita. And I think it's a nice opportunity for all of us to be here in this Sustainable Development Goals event. And I hope we have a very good debate on the subject of our table. So I have organized a text to talk a little bit about how the meeting of post-structuralist ideas and gender have to do with political identity in our days. So I will read for you a little text for the later debate. I hope it's going well. It's going well. So, post-structuralist ideas have had a wide influence in recent years to the field of gender. Some important ways in which post-structuralists impose problems and dislocate some traditional categories such as discourse, body, subject, identity, and power are increasingly important to researchers and scholars working in the field of gender. I would like to explore, focusing on Butler thought, the problematization of the notion of subject in this encounter between post-structuralism and gender, with the intention of collecting, in this point, an important critical gesture for the debate on gender inequality. Butler presents a reflection of the problems of a philosophy that starts from unquestionable assumptions placed outside the limits of critical possibility. The acceptance of a subjectivity prior to the critical exercise and, more than that, understood as the very condition of criticism would indicate a type of reflection not truly committed to thinking about the normative contours of the subject and is also incapable of taking the critique placed premises. From here, I want to suggest that the clash around the subjectivity problem goes beyond the scope of academic debate. Currently, institutionalized political narratives and social media have instrumentalized this debate through a rhetoric that announces the danger of the postmodern, of the post-structuralism, and the fragmentation of the subject. Danger generally seen as embodied in the agenda of racial and gender groups. This political appropriation operates from mistaken analogies. First, the difference between political identity and human in general is placed as the same as the duality between fragment and whole. This comparison is responsible to guide this discussion through a second, also strategic analogy between criticism of the subject as of the human, which serves to interpret agendas headed by certain aims, groups, or parties as immediately good or full of risks. The whole and the part duality leads us to suppose that the subject fragmentation is immediately its renunciation and the human downfall. The identification of identity policies as an exercise in fragment would consequently be a source of crisis and the conception of humanity. This interpretation received the attention of butlers who, at the beginning of the article Precarious Life, asked the question, have the humanities sabotaged themselves with all their relativism, questioning, and criticism, or have they been sabotaged by all those oppose their relativism, questioning? What I intended here is to think about what is in stake in the register of the critic of subjectivity, specifically with regard to its reputed consequences, fragmentation, annihilation of the subject, and, by order of consequence, also of the general idea of human, because these are political accusations mobilized against gender policies. In this sense, the analysis of performativity in Butler will be taken as a starting point, since performative process remove the subject from its original metaphysical context in order to re-signify it in terms of achievement, and most of all, point out how the normativity foundations of subjectivity operates significant exclusion for all bodies and forms of life that do not act in accordance with such norms. Once some important aspects of the performative construction of subject are clarified, I will shortly treat some mistakes in the approximation of the fragmentation of the subject as a crisis of the human. Performativity is one of the most central notions in Butler's thought. It has marked her reflections since the 90s, when she have dealt with gender performativity, until the most recent works that deal with political performativity. My intention is to expose, in relation to performativity, its point of conflict with a philosophy of the subject, or, in other words, with the metaphysics of substance. The precise context of the initial formulation of this theme is that of gender theory, where Butler claims that not only gender, but also sex, the sexed body, and its materialization is not a natural and previously given reality in relation to the referentiality of the discourse. Less than a radical rejection of the subject, performativity points to the mobility of its inscriptions as a foundation that is constantly being replaced and therefore is no longer constituted from a strong and metaphysical meaning. This displacement is an activity for the theoretical posture, which claims the impropriety of establishing points placed outside what can be questioned. Establishing the subject as a point external and prior to political activity, and therefore as the very basis from which the later is possible, would be to give the subject an assured exclusion for the position of questioning its existence and constitutive status. The performativity thought, thus, is established by putting into question what lies outside the debate, as Butler says. Indicates the look that is directed to the processes of linguistic constitution of bodies and subjects. Considering the performative, the relationship between language and body does not result from an isolated constructive act, but from processes that is never definitely finished, so that materialization of bodies through language indicates not a demiurgical production of matter, but the referential processes that confers intelligible contours to bodies that are made in their continued relationship with linguistic norms and meanings. The terrain of performative, therefore, is as well known, would not be that of constructivism, but that of deconstruction, since this takes place under the explicit guide of Derridian citationality and iterability. Acting and speaking always occur in a time and space different from the codes already made and to be done, which means that such context changes are also changes in meanings, resignifications. Thus, the normative in the basis of closing and opening its own constrictions brings it in the conditions for its modification. The construction thought is in performative character is a construction whose beginning and end vertices are unstable. For Butler, the critique of the subject needs to accompany the complex relationship between norms and the citational act, where the reiteration of norms is not simply compliance, adherence, or obedience, but at doing that, by repeating the conventions through maintenance and displacement, performs and existential stylistics. Precisely because reiteration exposes the binding and enabling character of norms, that the condition of the subjects to take place can be thought in terms of contingence and immanence, as well as their previously necessary limits are reconfigured as contingent. So, fragmentation and critique of the subject, are they path of barbarism? The analysis of the subject's performative realization, while removing the autonomous and sovereign subject prior and independent of the normative conditions that make it possible, is not a complete annihilation of the subject by verifying its condition of regulatory fiction. Differently from that, the subjectivity problems persists exactly along the lines of criticism, and its importance is renewed. If subjects are not ontologically fixed realities, but ontological effects related to normative contexts, it is necessary at the same time to recognize their ways of life constituting the interiority of the current reiteration of categorical contours and ways of life that constitute in their exteriority and incomprehensible, not as an ontological but epistemological exterior. The critical character of Butler post-structuralism so far outlines subjectivity as realization, subjectivity as process and movement. Only with that, the problem I initially mentioned, whether the criticism and crisis of the subject can compare to the humanist crisis, reaches some space of reflection. Now, the view is no longer aimed at the academic debate. I start to think about how certain political narratives, institutionalized in parties or present in ideological groups on social networks, have made caricature an instrumental use of the critique of the subject, strategically presenting it in a border design that divide dangerous agenda, refusal of the universal subject as a refusal of the human, of those healthy ones. First mistake of this political narrative: the juxtaposition of the subject as a fragment and identity policy. To begin here, it doesn't seem at all clear what a subject as a fragment is. Would the reference to the fragment be an expression of the temporal, space, and cultural contingencies to be considered in order to give the subject shapes and concreteness? Or, different from that, does it refer to the breaking of the subject to the point of making him unrecognizable and impossible? In the first case, the critical reflection of the subject still takes place. In the second, it is just destructive and paralyzing. As for the fragment and the identity analogy, here too, mediations are needed. The notion of identity, as handled by political narrative, interested in placing it on the logic of certain groups of the whole, is only one possible conception of identity. More than that, even if one wants to read each and every identity group or movement in opposition to what belongs to the subject as a whole, several typical elements of subjectivity are replaced in the identity discourses, and this presents a problem for the schematic opposition. Much of the identity action despite requiring consideration of the specific and contingent conditions of asymmetric and prejudiced treatments to which certain groups are subjected, demonstrate clear difficulty with regard to self-assertion, in doing it without falling back on the search for recognition in typical normative terms. These considerations leads us to another problem, the ambiguity surrounding the idea of political identity placed as a fragment. The idea of identity presented as a part, unable to compose with the whole, practically erases the perception of certain metaphysical remnants, as well as weakens the consideration of its movements in search of recognition and normative human condition, from which some groups were constituted in the exclusion. Butler, when dealing with identity, sees in it a tangle of borders. There is a decided denial of the substantialist character of the identity and should be thought of, it will be in the need to analyze its modes of construction and its constitutive spaces. What appears is not thinking about identity by refusing the concept of human, but precisely the search for recognition of this condition, appealing to the mobility of borders that fix narrow forms of existence. More than that, appealing not only to mobility, but to the questioning of the categorical criteria of borders that make viable lives and no viable lives. The critique of identity in these modes marks the movement of refusal of the universal subject in what its figure established limits to the existence, pleading not its extinction, but inclusive flexibility. It is taught the expansion of the idea of human that the identity must move, exposing its epistemological borders whose ontological effects are exclusionary. It is necessary to change the way of conceiving identity positions. They should not be retained as rigid structural positions, but as temporal, dynamic places that connect and interrelate with each other and which, furthermore, under a democratic impulse, do not cease to critically modify the exclusionary actions they carry out. Butler warns us, current identity rests on a series of exclusions, of acts of cruelty. In an interview given by Butler to Elvira Burgo Dias and Maria Prado Ballarin, there is a repeated concern with the impermeability and violence of the hegemonic subject. Moving the normative limits that so arbitrarily surrounds these subjects implies transforming the limits of formation of the I and pluralizing the lives capable of entering the subject's evaluative and ethical conditions. And this way, the fragmentation of the subject means an opening to relevant forms of life to be sheltered under this sign. The denunciation of the subject as a contingent, therefore, is not his downfall, but the possibility of contesting the criteria of exercising and belonging to this category. Putting it into thought in relation to exclusion and dispossession comes to matter for the consideration of a less violent politics. The control of the notion of subject as a necessary category is the clash with the critical perspective as a fragment form that shakes such conditions, ends up revealing a dispute around the very issue of the human and which lives can be considered human lives. What I simply intended with the path taken was to examine some mistakes or strategies in the narrative, some academics and other institutional policies that regard the criticism of the subject as dangerous and responsible for human crisis. The death of man, if minimally the object of the agenda, concerned its founding normative character, which established limits assumed as necessary. criticism exposed here is an exercise in moving such limits to the contingent in order to enter into the field of the viable forms of life constituted in the exteriority of the established limits. So I had another very big part of this analysis that was not only concerning about the difference between the part and the whole. It was about the problem of seeing the part as the impossibility to think and the subject in universal terms, but I let it aside because there was no time possible to explain all of these different passages. So I have concentrated my text only in this passage to the debate that we will have shortly. So thank you very much again. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to greet everyone again.
Thank you very much, Professor Ângela and my friend Ângela, for your wonderful presentation. Well, the questions will, we're going to address the question at the end of the three presentations, okay? And I immediately invite Professor Elsie. Are you here? I'm going to
yeah,
present.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear and see me now?
Yes. I will present you, Elsie. Well, welcome. Welcome to this seminary. I'm going to make a presentation of you, and then you start your presentation, okay?
Okay.
Professor Elsie Vieira, professor at the Queen Mary University of London, of Brazilian and Comparative Latin American Studies, coordinator of Lusophony Studies, coordinator of Camões Grant, PhD tutor in modern language. Elsie Vieira had a previous career at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. She, after visiting professorship in Oxford and Nottingham, she came to Queen Mary in 2002, where she has introduced Brazilian cultural studies in Brazilian cinema. Post-colonial theory underlines her modules of Lusophony, African culture, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Her book, City of God in Several Voices, Brazilian Social Cinema as Action, 2005, reflects one of her major research interests, the expressions of minorities. A previous project focused on the politicization of the expression of the disposed. The resulting database, Landless Voices, presently hosted by Queen Mary University of London, comprised a first-hand organization of the expression of the landless rural workers in Brazil, over 20 million people across several media, as well as reference material. Another national project, Gender and Brazilian Migration, founded by Brazil's National Research Council, was co-directed by Professor Graciela Ravetti, Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, with the participation of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora through Professor Ana Beatriz Gonçalves. Thank you very much, Professor Elsie, and that's with you now. For your presentation.
I sent a PowerPoint beforehand. I don't know whether it can be made available. If not, I'm not used to Zoom. If you could tell me how to insert the PowerPoint into Zoom. Yeah. Okay. While you tell me.
Ask Marja. Marja, could you help us, please? I never did that
with Zoom. Okay. While Mother helps us a little, I would like to begin with my warm thanks to Professor Maria Rita Cesar and to Professor André Duarte, whom I had the pleasure of exchanging a number of views in their contribution to one that's ended, which I will focus on, but another that is ongoing at the moment. And Sonia, who comes after me, we have shared a lot of knowledge production, but also what I'll be focusing on, that is the impact outside the university of knowledge produced in universities, with a specific focus on the inclusiveness of non-normative sexualities. And Sonia's presentation, we will have agreed, will be a follow-up to mine. I'll go up to 2019, and she will take over from there. And and I would also like to thank the colleague Ângela Couto Machado Fonseca for her very solid and thorough contribution in taking up the philosophy of gender mostly, which paves this theoretical input, paves the way for my presentation. And so what I would need to do at this moment is someone to help me, because we never use Zoom here. So I don't quite know how to fit my presentation onto the screen. Is there any way I could do it? If anyone can tell me.
Professor, please.
Yeah.
Yes, Professor, please, on the bottom of your screen,
Yes.
there is some icons, say participants, chat, and share screen.
Yes, that's
Then you click there, share screen.
Yeah.
And you can choose in your browse we can see now. As you are in a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes. Can you see a green map
yes.
of Brazil? Okay, great. So
Yes,
you can see it now. If I stumble along the way, my apologies for dealing with a system I'm not familiar with. And as mentioned, my intervention will be more of a practical nature. Which is but of course underlying it is the thorough theoretical background that we received from colleague Ângela Fonseca. And I'll be addressing the promotion of same-sex inclusiveness and equality in countryside schools in Paraná. It's with immense pleasure that I accept this invitation to join this initiative, this conference initiative in Paraná, because over the years, it has been a very fruitful international collaboration. So I'll focus specifically on an international collaborative project between the Federal University of Paraná, represented by Dr. Sonia Schwendler, and Queen Mary University of London. Sonia will come after me, far from me wishing to be hierarchical at all. It's just that it's a chronological follow-up to what we have there. And the two of us successfully submitted to the Newton Trust in the United Kingdom and developed this collaborative project, Gender and Education in rural Brazil. And it was developed in the agrarian reform settlements in Paraná. For those who are not aware of it, Paraná has as many as some 300 agrarian reform settlements. So it's a major feature of the state's history that perhaps not all who may be in the audience may be familiar with these facts. And the project we developed was along two main axes: the sexual division of labor and gender diversity. But our focus today will be on gender diversity. The proposal was submitted in 2014 and developed between 2015 and 18. And it was in the context of Brazil's legalization of same-sex marriages and homoparenting, same-sex marriages in 2013 and homoparenting in 2016. And in an exploratory workshop in two major schools in Paraná's agrarian reform settlements, the students proposed a theme. It was their proposal. We had gone there with one intention, but you know what happens so much in research when we get our hands on, all of a sudden we need to change direction. And what the students stressed a lot was the suffering and exclusion of homosexuals in the countryside. And they added it had to do with the recent potentialized projection of both same-sex marriages and homoparenting in Brazilian media, particularly in soap operas. And they stressed that there were profound generational differences between the reception of this new moment in Brazil legal system and, of course, cultural system. That was the adolescents' open mindset and fostering of inclusiveness, and the parents and grandparents' interdiction of the subject. So, what motivated me, of course, there is great topicality when we look into the very impact of such a major legal change. And, but looking in terms of methodology, from the point of view of the UK and all the support that the Newton Trust and the British Academy gave us, this was motivated by the increasing demands upon researchers in the UK to define and to demonstrate social impact in order to secure funding for their research. What do they mean by impact, more specifically social impact? It's not necessarily just working with social themes, but how the new knowledge produced in universities reach out and benefit non-academic users or users outside the university, society, culture, public policymakers, services, health, and in our specific case, the secondary schools. So in my presentation today, and I will be talking about some examples collected when adolescent students in the countryside in the agrarian reform settlements, together with Dr. Schwendler and myself, we introduced gender diversity and gender equality in the syllabi of secondary schools. And it was an international project. And I'm very proud to be able to talk again to my colleagues, but also to others in the audience, that this project conducted with the Federal University of Paraná was very well received by the School of Modern Languages and Cultures of Queen Mary. It was part of a 7-year research exercise. The evaluation of research in the United Kingdom is every 7 years. And in the last one, it had started a little bit in the previous one, but the one that started in 2014 and is coming to an end now in 2021, only 2 projects were selected to represent the school. School is the word we use here for faculdade, and one of the colleges of the university. So it was with immense pleasure that we received recognition for what is very demanding, that is the question of impact. And I sympathize a lot with this notion of impact, because at times most of us perhaps have had this conflict in life. Who is benefiting from the research that we produced? Of course, we know that research has a multiplying effect, and it may reach out to many people who will then elaborate on the existing research. But when we think who beyond the university milieu benefits from this research. So we had this most gratifying experience of bringing several strands of knowledge into the countryside and seeing how it could benefit them. And please pay attention that my institution capitalizes on social impact, or not capitalizes, it valorizes social impact. So this was the underlying methodological motivation of the project. But it was very interesting that in Paraná, colleagues would look at it as political impact. And I asked permission to Professor Maria Rita César to quote her on a presentation she gave here at Queen Mary. And this presentation brings out the political impact of this project on gender equality and inclusiveness. Can I quote Maria Rita? Yeah, the project's introduction of topics on gender equality and sexual diversity in the syllabi of Brazilian countryside high schools has a clear impact on the production of practice and discourses oriented towards gender equality and against discrimination of the LGBT rural population. Research projects like this affirm the possibility of constructing alternative narrative spaces and social and subjective practices related to gender equality and against violence and discrimination in rural areas. This is a fundamental space of resistance against fundamentalism and structural violence that organizes life in Brazil rural areas. And we created a database. It's immense. It's easily available. It's called landlessvoices2.org. And I'll just fish out elicit some examples from the database. So it was most gratifying to see adolescents promoting a gender and homo parenthood inclusive school. I don't know whether the drawing that they made is clear, but they show a school that is welcoming to the children from homo parenthood. So you see here the two boys taking the child to school, one asking, what is it? And then we see two women. And so, we need, and they say that we need to dissociate sexuality from the way we look at a person. Dissociate is not quite the right way of putting it, but we should look at people as human beings in every sense. And this is a point that they made very often. And I would like to emphasize that the youth in the settlements, they are quite politicized, much more politicized than we could have imagined. When we had some seminars with students in the education MA, they were also very surprised at how politicized those children and adolescents are. So we could tap on this generation's political potentiality that they inherited from the historical process of land struggle. Or in Menhai's terms, we could see that those students who inherited this political potentiality from land struggle, they were now ready to realize this potential in a different context. That was the context of legal change in Brazil, but in parallel, increasing political retrocess. And those students, they challenged exclusion and homophobia. I will bring just a few quotes from some poems, and I'll bring in from time to time their drawings as well. It's an immense directory. But they created a poem, The Right to Love and Have Fun. It was composed by very young students of the 8th and 9th grades of primary education from the Lapa settlement. They broadened the spectrum of conjugalities, and they expressed the need for greater recognition of homosexuals' right to public visibility, including that of their affection in leisure moments. Let's see them, the right to love and have fun. The original in Portuguese is on the left. Prejudice is huge, but if we stop and sing, they've got that loving feeling, woman with woman and men with men. They also have the right to love dancing. And the accompanying illustration is very, very interesting because it shows exactly something that is usually denied to homosexuals. That is the right to have leisure moments in public. So we have here men with men and women dancing. By the way, if I can just make a short parenthesis here, there is the equivalent here in the UK to a dança dos famosos. It's called here Strictly Come Dancing. They're getting to the end of the competition now. And one of the best dancers, they seem to be at least candidates to be the winners. It's a homosexual couple. Well, anyway, parallel with the legal advancement, or perhaps in a response to it, we could see an encroaching political conservatism in Brazil. And if you don't mind, I'll quote from the first paragraph of a book of mine that has just come, in which I emphasize a lot this encroaching political conservatism. Dressed in ceremonial white for her inauguration as the Minister of Human Rights in Jair Bolsonaro's presidency of Brazil, blatantly overlooking the full spectrum of colors of the rainbow flag, proudly did Damaris Alves, a former evangelical pastor and ardent defender of a Genesis ideology, reinforce a heteronormative gender script. Her naive views of a gender color coding, girls were pink and boys were blue, associated with babies. This color coding is clearly associated with baby, actually masks her anti-gender crusade, which disqualifies and pathologizes homosexuals and criminalizes struggles for gender equality. Gays want to take the Bible out of circulation in Brazil. Sex between women is an aberration comparable to sex with animals. Homosexuals are sick. The minister added in the ceremony that the state is lay, but this minister is terribly Christian and a believer in God's designs. In addition to other statements that the time has come for the church to rule the country. I'm not saying anything here. I'm not analyzing the positive or whatever they may be. It's not a judgment on churches. I'm addressing conservatism and how they use biblical language and biblical ideas to legitimize conservatism and exclusion. And so, and she is one of the religious fundamentalists and extreme right factions in Brazilian politics that saw in Bolsonaro their chance to ascend to power. And the appointment of this terribly Christian minister is in fact the materialization of a growing theocratic direction and disregard for advances in human rights, which culminated in Bolsonaro's election to the presidency. Such ultra-conservative discourses, a part and parcel of today's neoconservative geopolitics, gained prominence in Brazil in the wave of protests that peaked in June 2013, which we're all familiar with. Now, so, and adolescents and teachers in the settlements of agrarian reform in Brazil challenge the oppressive and exclusionary religious caucus in Congress, as well as the truth regimes of a Genesis ideology which supports them. There is a generational dissensus that particularly informs the students' materialist poetics and lyrics as they advance a progressive countryside gender agenda and promote the dignifying of those socially excluded by their gender orientation or sexual orientation. They also seek to mitigate the pain of homosexuals victimized by homophobia. And their poems express their claims for transgender equity and respect. There is one that I'm not use here because of lack of time, but there is one, this one is a teacher who challenges the religious extremist objection and belittling of homosexuals in equally biblical terms. Equality, respect, the right to be who I am, to use the color I want and be accepted by them. I come to tell you, if you disrespect me, you don't accept me, I may be blood of your blood. I've been devalued, homosexual, transvestite. I'm just like you. Death I've already felt. I shout, cry out for respect. Let all accept me as I am. I'm a human being. And there are other cries against the intimidating ideology of Genesis. Another poem, this time by a student, why, transcribed by a teacher, why was I born wrong? I'm avoiding the students' names and identification here to protect their identities on ethical grounds, please. The title, Why Was I Born Wrong, encapsulates the sense of profound inadequacy of an oppressed lesbian youth coming to terms with a non-normative sexuality, perceived as pathological by ever-encroaching outer-conservative discourses. The adolescent student unburdens her painful gender conflicts. It's a first-person narrative that bespeaks the ritual of confession, which permeates the secondary student's internalized mandate to articulate her sexual peculiarity anonymously. She recited it to the teacher. The ritual of confession, you know, is an inheritance from Christianity, and it has in sexuality a privileged theme that liberates, but also unleashes a power relationship. She questions the historically constituted concept of normality. It's historically constituted, it's ingrained, and it also breeds a profound sense of inadequacy, which she says, she problematizes. What is normal? Unhappy, agonizing, out of the way, hard to accept I wasn't normal. To this day, I suffer, dream, ponder, and still haven't found the answer. I only wanted in my heart to have been born, grown, lived, loved as a normal woman. I long, desire, date, disagree, unequal dreams. We know from Foucault that confession unfolds a power relationship. But what is this external power, both requiring the confession, but also stifling the youth? We can perhaps surmise that it's this intimidating climate that is increasingly being institutionalized in Brazilian, that is today's epicenter of new conservative power, while at the same time, you know, that this epicenter of new conservative power, the poem is called Yellow Brazilian. Yellow, why yellow for Brasilia? We know that yellow is quite clearly associated with cowards, people who lack a bit of courage, etc., or perhaps excessively, but in the wrong direction. But the title Yellow Brazilian deconstructs the image of a city's iconic white architecture that we know is evocative of dawn of a new beginning in the 1960s. Yellow Brasilia, then. Brazil, such an honorable country, will not accept, will not respect others, nor the difference in us all. We want equality, respect in society, freedom of expression. Loving is the answer. La, 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 la. Okay? So, so they also challenge the positivist star symbolism of Brazilian official symbols. We know that the symbolism of constellations in Brazil's official discourses, it creates a sense of unity for the country, but it also homogenizes individuals into a collective. And would there be only one sky in a continental-sized country? Isn't there a denial of differences of the very core of LGBT advances worldwide? And this denial is emphasized via repetition of the refrain below. And when the adolescent reads persisting disrespect in Brazil's history, our sky has more stars. Mine, yours, the celestial sky of us all. By the way, how many skies are there? How many different beings are there? There are different skies and different beings too, as colleague Ângela so well cast in terms of subjective identities. Now, Congress is also targeted by the students' poems, and their wish is to make history follow a different path. And the aim was to establish an alternative to all forms of exclusion that finds a fertile soil in the students' recent gender agenda propitiated by the project. They have a poem that's called "What Culture Is This?" Of course, all of us, this is emphatically repeated in the refrain. Of course, we will recall that it echoes a 1978 song, Que País é Este? What Country Is This? That was composed by Renato Russo, and it's paradigmatic of the politicized stream of Brasilia rock. Russo lived in Brasilia, and he challenged officiality in a number of ways. He bitterly addresses corruption and the government's hypocrisy vis-a-vis the Brazilian constitution. He stressed that even though Congress was reopened and elections were in place, civil and social rights were not respected. And he addresses the Indians, the natives, the Blacks, etc. This in Renato Russo's case. But the students appropriate Renato Russo's discourse, and they pick up the baton from Renato Russo, but this time promoting, challenging Brazilians and prejudices that are rampant in Brasilia. And so what culture is this? Prejudice is a huge problem for the nation's future. What culture is this? Repeated. A culture that's wrong, that makes us different, because love is normal, whether same-sex or not. What culture is this? They ironically repeat the refrain. And you know that Renato Russo belonged to the band Aborto Elétrico, that was a forerunner of the Legião Urbana band. And those bands were formed during the country's flexibilization of the military rule. And its first record was released in 1985 when democracy was re-established. And the students in the settlement of agrarian reform, as said, have picked up the baton from Russo. And the intertext, what culture is this, is 6 times emphatically repeated in the poem. And what country is this? Shows that the problem, it's not just during the dictatorship, it remains very meaningful in other days. Or perhaps an unfinished past has returned to the present. There's a young generation of Brazilian organic intellectuals, if I may call those politicized students in the agrarian reform settlements. They may have absorbed from Brazilian-based revolutionary rock the energy to protest and adapted the discourse and musical genre to today's context of state-sanctioned homophobia. And also it's a political voice that they inherited from their parents. So let's go back to social and pedagogic and political impact, but also address the theme of the conference quickly here, that is the theme of sustainability. We cannot deny that there was a pedagogical contribution. I'm sure Sonia will agree with me that it was one of the most marking moments in our professional life, when we saw those students who wanted to say something, but as we know, as part of the duality of the oppressed, they want to say something, but they have internalized fear and oppression, if I can echo Paulo Freire here. But the fact then is that at first they were very reticent, they used mostly drawings, but then they began to verbalize. And the ones that I've presented in which they challenge Brazilian was on the last day of our last workshop in the agrarian reform settlements. And we don't know whether we would smile with a great satisfaction of being such open-minded students responding to the activity that we developed there, or whether we would shed tears because it came to an end. And so I'll refer briefly here to Abby Epstein and Richard Johnson, the term schooling sexuality. For those thinkers, we need to move towards the insertion of non-normative sexualities in the syllabi through resources. In this case, we did it in producing resources together with students as subjects of their own discourses, and also which express their own reality. And so we were very pleased that we could insert such a sensitive topic, or that, well, in other words, that we schooled sexualities, more specifically non-normative sexualities. So the social impact, if we use the UK terminology, was acknowledged by the university, by the academia in the UK, and in that the Gender Diversity Inclusiveness Project, it promoted the development of new attitudes and practice. This was irrefutable, and was very much in the testimonials of the schoolmasters in the two schools where we developed the project. The other one was Iraci Salete Strozeski in Rio Bonito do Iguaçu. In both schools, we see that the project pioneered in promoting an out-of-the-closet education in an unfavorable context, that is, of heteronormative ideologies of countryside schools. The schoolmasters thanked us a lot, and we also thank them tremendously, and the students in particular. It was a most gratifying experience that we had. And the headmasters talked about change in attitudes in the schools, that students would not accept jokes against homosexuals, those jokes that constitute the homosexual subject, giggles, jokes, that or negative terms, so they would not accept anymore. Students changed a lot in the attitude along the process. And he also told something that was extremely meaningful to us. That was one occasion when some students, for some reason, had left the school and went elsewhere. And they saw the huge difference, that they suffered homophobia a lot in the other school, and they returned to the original school that was accommodating and had developed more enlightened attitudes. So we can say, I hope, that the political dimension, now bringing in a parameter, that Paraná brought, that was the political dimension, we can say that it was an achievement. Students were in a climate of intimidation. They were able to advance an inclusive and respectful agenda for homosexuals, inclusive and dignifying agenda for homosexuals. One question that I ask, now talking about the parameter of impact, was it localized? It's a question that we are unable, at least I'm unable to answer at the moment. Another thing, this group of students, when we returned there for a follow-up in 2019, many students had graduated and God knows where they were. What happened to the next generation of students that did not have a chance of finding open-minded researchers who gave them an echo chamber to express their anxieties and to develop an inclusive agenda for same-sex couples and home parenthood. So what happened to the next generation? We don't know. Was it localized? Did it have an impact just in Paraná? Of course, we had a number of seminars with the teachers, and we hope that this was somehow integrated into their activities. But was it localized? We don't know. We don't have the instruments to gauge this. But one thing is important: impact hinges on continuity. So what can be achieved in terms of sustainability? How can we develop a post project? Okay, and I end here then. I hope I did not put too much for you to follow. I apologize for my inadequacy with Zoom. And for me, it's a pleasure that Sonia, with whom I have collaborated for many, many years now, she will talk a little about the follow-up, but in another direction now. Thank you. Sonia?
Yes, Professor Elsie, please, in your upper screen, you have stop sharing, a little red button, stop sharing in your Zoom screen. Thank you. Please, Professor Sonia, step ahead, step forward.
I will present Sonia. I'm sorry, I was muted. Sonia, I will present you. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Professor Sonia Schwendler has a PhD in Iberian and Latin American Studies from the University of London, Queen Mary College, with CAPES scholarship. She is Associate Professor at the Federal University of Paraná, working in the postgraduate program in education. She's honorary researcher at the University of London, Queen Mary College, sponsored by the British Academy Newton Advanced Research Fellow. She has developed a project on gender and education in rural areas in Brazil, 2015-2018. She's a member of the Paraná Articulation for a Rural Education and vice leader of the Gender Studies Research Group at UFPR, Federal University of Paraná. She is co-author of the book Paulo Freire, Life and Work, 2001, and co-author and organizer of the books Exercising Citizenship in Motion, Theory and Everyday Practice, 2010, Agrarian Conflict, Their Subjects, Their Rights, 2015, Theories and Policies of Gender in Contemporary Times, 2017. She has experience in the field of sociology and education with an emphasis on gender and sexual diversity studies, gender, education and curriculum, human rights, diversity, difference and social inequality, social movements and rural education, comparative studies in Latin America. And when I thank it, Professor Elsie, my microphone was muted. So I'd like to thank you, Elsie, very much for your powerful and very important presentation. And we're going to talk about it after Sonia, okay? Sonia, you may start, please.
Thank you very much, Maria Rita and Andrea, my colleagues from the university and from the program of education, Ângela and Elsie. It's a pleasure to be also with you here in this meeting. I would like to ask, I think it's Margie who are going to share my presentation, please. Okay. Then this presentation that I am giving here, as Elsie said, is a follow-up of the project that Elsie just presented to us. And I call this short presentation like the gender equality and diversity in UK schools, specifically in England schools. This is related to a postdoctoral research at Queen Mary, University of London, together with Professor Vieira, and in collaboration also with the Institute of Education, University College of London, through the sponsorship of CAPES and the international program of internationalization of UFPR. And this is, next, please. This is a comparative project called Gender Diversity in School Curricula, a comparative study of educational policies in Brazil and UK, focuses on the controversial issues of the inclusion of gender diversity within the school curricula. This research argues that even it's not intentionally gender-related issues are already present in the curriculum, in extracurricular activities and school cultures. This argument is based on the theoretical foundation of critical pedagogy, feminist and queer studies, and this research investigates how schools in Brazil and UK have understood and reacted to the inclusion and exclusion of gender-related issues, particularly gender diversity within the school curriculum. And it further looks into secondary school teachers' discourses and experience and training of gender inclusive syllabus. And data collection is related mainly to oral history methodology. Gender equality, in this presentation, I will focus just on the ongoing project and the part that I'm already have worked on in 2020, but I still continue to work on this, and then I will focus more on gender equality and diversity in UK schools. I would like to say that the importance of the legal guidance for a gender inclusive curriculum is, but which is very new in UK, called Relationship and Sex Education. And I would like to address in this talk why the teaching of LGBT issues despite being part of strands of diversity of protected characteristics of the 2010 Equality Act in UK, it has become also contentions in England in 2019. And I will discuss how LGBT issues have been addressed in the new legal guidance, with special attention to its strength and limits to overcome heteronormative education. And I would like to say this part, the first part of my research with this, that I'm working together with Professor Elsie Vieira. This is based on extensive documentary research, newspapers, television programs, parliamentary debates, official government guidance, and online oral histories interviews with primary and secondary teachers and head teachers, relationships and sex education coordinators, university teachers, and organizations who are responsible for teachers training in UK. Just a bit of context to understand UK policy. In 2020, relationship and sex education became compulsory in all schools in England. UK, through reform legal guidance, following consultation that happened in 2018, has made compulsory relationships education in all primary schools and relationships and sex education in all secondary schools, as well as health education in all state-funded schools in England. Before of that, just to let you know that there was a sex and relationships education policy. It was related to 2000, in which every school could make up their own policy, and it was up to each school to teach or not sex education. Now it became compulsory. It was since September 2020, but because COVID, schools could start to implement this policy only in summer 2021, at the end of the academic year. Something that I would like to underline here, that all the compulsory subjects content, according to the Department of Education, the DFII, must be age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. The documents that also assures that schools are free to determine how to deliver the content set, which is out of this guidance, and the context of a broad and balanced curriculum. But they are required to consult with parents and carers who have no rights to veto. It implies respect to the backgrounds also and beliefs of students and parents, while always with the aim to providing students with the knowledge they need in terms of what is a requirement of the law. Something that is very important to say is what we call the Protected Characteristics of Equality Act. It was enacted in 2010. And in UK equality, there is a legal foundation, we can say, for a gender inclusive curriculum since 2010 for all schools, despite we have just this guidance, a compulsory guidance now in England schools. Under the provision of the Equality Act, schools must not unlawfully discriminate against students because of their age, sex, race, disability, religion, or beliefs, gender reassignment, pregnancy or maternity, marriage or civil partnership, or sexual orientation. Collectively, this law is called protected characteristics. We can say that the new guidance advise that schools should be alive to issues such as everyday sexism, misogyny, homophobia, and gender stereotypes, and take positive actions to build a culture where there are not tolerated and are occurrences are identified when homophobia or all this sexism are identified, they need to be tackled. Something very important that I would like to discuss also is the rationality, the reasons for the relationships education for children. In this presentation, even though my reason, the initial idea was to discuss more secondary schools, because what was happening in England about all the protests, the reactions against the implementation of this policy that happened in 2019, I choose to focus here in this presentation more on primary schools, because I also interviewed teachers from primary schools, and this is very important, was very important for me to understand the whole policy and the ongoing struggles. We can say that there was a recognition that every child and young person in England should have the right to school-based relationships and sex education. And there is evidence that comprehensive relationship in sex education in primary schools can be transformative. It can help children to make informed decisions in relationships, be confident about their development and their bodies from the earlier age, improve the health and future intimate relationships, and be more inclusive of diverse sexual and gender identities. Studies also suggest that many children struggle with their own body image, and even before they leave primary schools at the age of 11, because in England, secondary school started from the age of 11 to 16, which is compulsory education. And even before they leave the primary school, many children experience gender and sexualized peer aggressions. I also would like to emphasize some elements that are important in relationships and sex education in primary schools. We can say that in this law, in this guidance, teaching these primary schools should focus on teaching the fundamental buildings on characteristics of positive relationships with particular relation to friendship, family relationships, relation with other children and with adults. Here, families should be understood as nurturing environments for children, and they can be seen made of many forms: single parent families, LGBT parents, family headed by grandparents, adoptive parents, foster parents, and cares, among other structures. After the end of primary schools, children should know that other schools, other families, either in the school or in the wider environment, sometimes look different from their own families, but they should respect those differences and know that other children's families are also characterized by love and care. Through relationships education and relationships and sex education, schools should teach students to the knowledge they need to recognize and to report abuse, including emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And the content set out in the Department for Education Guidance 2019 should be considered for the mandatory relationship and health education, and schools can determine whether they need to teach some aspects of age-appropriate sex education to meet the needs of their students, apart from what is included in the National Curriculum of Science. It's also important to mention that the Department for Education recommends that all primary schools should have a sex education program tailored to the age and physical and emotional maturity of the students. It should be considered a transition phase before moving to secondary school and must be sent out in schools policy. In this stage, parents should be consulted on what is to be covered and offered support in talking to their children about sex education and how to link this with what is being discussed at school. Primary schools that chooses to teach sex education must allow parents to right to take off the children from these lessons. And schools must also ensure that they teachers that they teaching and materials are appropriate, having regard to the age and religious background of the students. Then I would like to go to another sections of this presentation about relationships and sex education in terms of the controversial subjects of the school curriculum. This subject can be seen also as one of the most controversial subjects of the school curriculum that inspires debates nowadays. One of the major debates has been in terms of who should be responsible for children's learning about sexuality and relationships, what and how schools should address it, and when learning should take place. Also, according to Rachel, these disagreements are not pragmatic, but as decisions about relationships and sex education refers to deep-seated practices and beliefs about what schools are and for what they value. This controversy gains momentum in 2019, when England became the scenery of protests, which were already taking place in other parts of Europe and across the world. The main reason for the protest was the teaching of LGBT issues in schools, which could become compulsory at that time, with the implementation of RSC in September 2020. No protests were raised because of oppositions in the recognitions of other equality components like sex, race, of other protected characteristics under the equality law. LGBT focus was the source of contentions. We can say that while few would openly question the legitimacy of characteristics like age, sex, disability, religion, or renounce the equal teaching of these strands of diversity, sexual orientation and gender identity continue to draw disproportional attention on this relation. We can say that relationship and the inclusion of gender diversity has been seen by conservative religions and political leaders as a threat to the natural family, the question of traditional gender roles, and the attack of heterosexual norms or the promotion of homosexuality. Conflicts in England have been ongoing for several decades, related to how schools teach about issues related to homosexuality and same-sex relationships. We can see a moral panic based on Gail Rubin has been raised during the 2019 protest, that this moral panic resonates Section era, what was in law during 1988 until 2003, and which contrasts with this 20th century British values, We can say that Section 28, it was enacted in 1988 under Margaret Thatcher government, and it prohibited local authority from intentionally promoting homosexuality and prevented schools from promoting the acceptability of homosexual relationship as pretended family relationship. It's important to mention that at that time, the provision was enacted as part of a backlash against some local councils that began to adopt more progressive approaches to gay and lesbian issues by funding support groups and promoting inclusive approaches to sex education in schools. And we can say also that Section 28 from 1988 has a severe chilling effect on the circulation of knowledge about homosexuality and same-sex relationship in state-funded schools, even though the provision applies only to local education authorities and not to individual schools at that time. We can say also that only in 2019, 16 years after the repeal of the Section 28, students has mentioned in their teachings the access to equality opportunity to explore the features of stable and healthy same-sex relationships. Now I'm going to focus then on a bit of this protest, how it unfolded at that time. We can say that in the wake of the new guidance, which was published in 2019, leaflet campaigns and protests began outside primary schools across England, most notably Parkfield Community and Undertor Park primary schools in Birmingham. The protests started at Parkfield Community School, where 98% of families are Muslims. After a petition was raised in January 2019 against the No Outsiders project. At that time, they claimed the teaching contradicted the Islamic faith, according to the news. And No Outsiders, adopted by schools across the country, was created and started at Parkfield Community School by the assistant head teacher, Andre Moffat, who also was awarded in 2017 an MBA for services to equality and diversity in education. Based on Equality Act 2010, No Outsider teaches primary school children about diversity and a sense of belonging to 42 pictures books, enabling students to explore differences and attitudes toward acceptance. In that books, LGBT relationships should be taught in the context of British law, where all protected characteristics of Equality Act are included in the curriculum that celebrate differences. By doing this, sexual orientation and gender reassignment are placed on equal basis with other protected characteristics. However, the LGBT elements of the No Outsider program have remained in the only focus and source of contention for criticism. We can say that despite the government's support for equality teaching, which includes the understanding of different relationships, Parkfield School, which is the one that you can see in the picture, was put under immense pressure at that time by officials at the Department of Education to suspend the program. The temporary suspension of Outsiders happened, but it was also criticized by people from the National Secretary of the Association of Head Teachers, who at that time argued that it gave the impression to people that actually, if they turn up outside, no outsiders, a school with will to be able to continue with other schools will be able to just not focus on LGBT issues. In fact, what happens, the protest did not stop because they stopped the No Outsiders program. On the contrary, we can say that it was held daily, claiming the teaching contradicts the Islamic faith and the primary age children were too young to be aware of same-sex relationships. And they accused schools of proletizing homosexual way of life to children, subjected to them to indoctrination. Also, next slide, please. The following. Protests also aiming to stop LGBT relationships education as part of the equality teaching, spread to other schools in Birmingham, including Underthorpe Park Primary School. Some parents and campaigners also who had no children at the schools, holding banners saying, say no to sexualization of children and let kids to be kids, were repeated outside schools. They also said, children, our choice. Most of the protesters of the Muslim faith believe homosexuality to be a sin. We can say that schools across the country receive letters opposing the teaching of relationships and sex education and LGBT equality. The National Association of Head Teachers told BBC at that time that these issues have been raised directly over 70 schools, and letters have been sent to schools leaders asking the schools to stop teaching relationships education, and they threat to started also protests in other schools. Something very important is to say that in, if you could go back to the previous slide, please. In November 2019, the High Court prohibited demonstrations against LGBT inclusive education, which happened since February outside this Underthorpe Park school. It's important to mention that at that time, false claims were made against the school, which includes like a pedophile agenda and that staff were teaching children how to masturbate. Also, according to the Justice Marby, judge of the High Court of England and Wales, the person argued that Birmingham City Council has proof that this claim is not true and that the lessons had been misrepresented by parents, arguing that it's not been proven that the schools does not promote homosexuality, but it seeks to wave the language of equality into everyday school life. What is also important, next slide, please, to mention about the cultural clash, a conflict between the religions and education. It was mainly led to organized group with religions fundamentalist agenda, leading to a battle between conservative and liberal views. Religion challenges to be acceptive of LGBT identities and the prevalence of heteronormative attitudes are not new, research. The government decision to include LGBT issues within the new guidance has been contested by conservative religious groups like Muslims, Christians, Judges, and widely reported by the media and religions websites as well. We can say that even though forms of morality, conservative religion discourse about homosexuality no longer have the authority to shape law, it was during the past Section 28 era that religious interests and considerations continue to have important influence on debates regarding the legal framework that governs the circulation of knowledge about homosexuality and same-sex relationships in schools. It maintains an educational landscape in which young people face disparity and their access to teaching and discussions about issues related to homosexuality and same-sex relationships. However, also studies shows that LGBT, the barriers to LGBT inclusivity are not related and rooted only in religions, because they are created and maintained to conservative attitudes from individuals who permeate cross-sections of society, including politicians, psychologists, and university teachers. I would like to highlight to end this discussion how LGBT issues are included in the new guidance. In teaching relationships education in school should ensure that the needs of all students are appropriately met, and that all students understand the importance of equality and respect. Also, schools must ensure that they comply with the relevant provision of Equality Act, under which sexual orientation and gender reassignment are among the protected characteristics. It also advises that schools should ensure that all their teaching is sensitive and age appropriate is approach and in their approach and content. At the point that schools should consider it appropriate to teach their students about LGBT, they should ensure that this content is fully integrated into their entire program of study, rather than delivered on a standalone unit or lesson. Also, we can say that schools are free to determine how they do this, but there are expected all students have these lessons and during their curriculum. But what was a bit problematic in these guidelines is that the document called Plan Your Relationship, Sex and Health Curriculum, which was published in 2020, it states about LGBT teaching. It says that all students should receive teaching on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender relationships during their school years. Secondary schools should include LGBT content in their teaching, but primary schools are strongly encouraged and enabled when teaching about different types of family to include families with same-sex parents. I would like here to address some comments, very important comments of the one person. I interviewed about 20 people in the UK, and one was Sarah, the head teacher of Unterthorn Park Primary School. And when she analyzed all the protests and when she analyzed also the UK guidance, she said, I would like to read what she said here. So, what started off as being an absolutely brilliant idea to get all primary school and secondary schools in England to have the same policy, 80 or 90% of this is still true. But The bit that has caused the problem, as you know, it's LGBT. And it shouldn't. Of course, the problem is we have an Equality Act in the country, the one that I mentioned before in 2010. It is very clear about 9 protected characteristics. And she continues. What it says in the document, the one of the DFI, is that schools are strongly advised to teach children a bit different family exist and should not teach harmful stereotypes, but they strongly advise you to do it. In primary schools, there is a massive contradiction. I think in the policy, because it's stated several times that school must unfold their policy duty under the Equality Act 2010. It says that several times there are many paragraphs about equality, and there are many paragraphs that say, you know, you must not discriminate, you must not do this. But then in the bit about LGBT, it says, we strongly recommend you to do it, but you don't have to, basically, to do it. And it's just appealing because it doesn't seem like any other characteristics at all to talk about. And this is a real weakness in the policy, because we all know that relationships and at primary school level, relationship means like friendship. They don't mean sexual relationship, obviously. Then I would like to, I'm sorry that I think it takes a long time for me to present this, but I would like to finish with this quote. I have many other important interviews, but I would like in this presentation, because I focus on the policy and also the resistance to the policy through the protests. And it was important to at least bring some of the elements that have been outlined in the interviews when they analyze the current policy that have been implemented in England, compulsory since 2021, we can say now, even though it says 2020. And then all this presentation, this is relating to an ongoing study that I will continue to collect interviews here together with Elsie in Brazil, and then we will do this comparison related to the policies. And also in this study, I focus on secondary schools. As I said before, I think it was important to focus on primary schools, because the protest that happened in England was only about primary schools, not about, we couldn't see any protest outside secondary schools. This is something very important to mention. And then I would like to thank for the opportunity to share this research, part of this research, and to say this is in fact related to what we have already done in Brazil, and this wonderful presentation that Elsie gave about our work during 2015 and 2018. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Thank you very much for your great presentation. I would like to say to the people that is hearing us that you can write questions through the chat, please, and the presenters is going to answer the questions. Okay. Okay, I'm going backwards. I'm going propose some questions to start a debate, to start a talk about the presentations, and I will start with Sonia and then Elsie and Ângela, okay? And well, Sonia, thank you very much for sharing with us your latest research and the results of the research. And you brought such interesting things to think about Brazil and the backlash about sexuality in Brazil, the sexual education in Brazil, and the whole discussion on gender diversity and sexuality in Brazil in the last 4 or 5 years, and especially in the last 4 years in the Jair Bolsonaro's government. Well, I would like to address you a question about the legislation in the UK. It's very much it's very progressive. You showed us the school legislation, the compulsory sex education from 220, but all the backlash that UK is been going through, like other countries in the world, and our history in Brazil, which is a huge backlash if we compare with other countries too. And I'd like to ask you about if you have thought about comparing the two countries, what's going on there and what's going on here in Brazil. You showed us that the movements against sexual education in UK is about the prejudice in religious prejudice, especially in Muslim religions, and in Brazil is neo-Pentecostal and Catholics, but the difference is the Brazilian government supports this those movements against gender and sexuality discussion in school. So I'd like to hear you about this, the difference between UK and Brazil, and how would you say about this difference? How it seems that it's worldwide spread, this backlash, but I'm sure there are some peculiarities in each country that we're going to analyze, to do research, and the relationship between government, how the government stands on the policies, and how the government stands about the sexuality and gender equality. So just to start the conversation, and I will address immediately to Elsie, and thank you again for your presentation, and thank you for your quotation. It was a pleasure to discuss the facts of your research. It was a pleasure to be with you in Queen Mary, London. And by that time, we are discussing the impacts. And I still think exactly what I wrote to you. The impact is enormous. It's because I'm so sure that your research and Sonia's too had an impact in the movement, on the social movement, and bringing or helping the social movement, bringing the discussion on gender equality and diversity. And now at the University of Paraná, the post-graduation program, we can see those researchers from the social movement producing their theses, their dissertations about those issues. So I'm pretty sure that the impact is enormous. But I would like to ask you too, because you extended your research on more contemporary Brazilian situation, and I'd like to ask you about those impacts under this backlash in Brazil, where we have the policies from the government, and they are against sex education, against diversity, with an impact, enormous impact on the life of the people, in the life of the people, in the life of the students, in the life of the children. Sonia presented the discussion about sexual education in early childhood education in Brazil. This is a disaster because we have a very high rate of child abuse, and the sexual education in early childhood, it's a form of preventing child abuse. So I would like to hear you about this impact now. Well, what do you think about this? And Sonia is comparing to UK, but I'd like to hear you more about Brazil and the social movement. And Ângela, you see, I wrote down a question for you. Thank you again for your presentation. I'd like to ask you if you see connections between Butler's post-structuralist approach to the subject and the issue of overlap activities in the constitution of situated subjects. In other words, is there a hole in intersectionality in the constitution of subjects from a post-structuralist approach? So how do you think about those questions about intersectionality in this discussion that you presented us? Well, we gonna wait for you can answer those provocation, not questions exactly, but and then I will see if there are more questions at the chat. Thank you. I don't know if we can answer Sonia, Elsie, and Ângela, or other way around. Ângela.
The order of the questions was interesting. Beginning with Sandra, Sonia, that was the most recent. Oh, it's, no, I'm not muted. Ângela is muted.
Okay, should I begin? We are going to do the first
Ângela,
movement.
thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I enjoyed very much Elsie and Sonia work. I was here making notes and I have a little question. I don't know if I will have time to do it, but let's see. So Rita, this is a trick question. The difference between post-structuralist approach and intersectionality. I will first say very engaged by the text, Butler's writings, that she don't disinvolve specifically the term intersectionality. She don't go to this area, but if we go to her first great book about gender, Gender Trouble, we'll see that she begins that book just saying how the look of identity that is made by a very long traditional feminist approach is a look that seems to see the subject woman as a whole, a subject woman that just don't seem to be in the exercise of the day life, in the different cultures, different situations, different classes, all the difference that can't be disregarded, to think about the subject woman, not about a whole subject, not like a universal subject, but a very located one that should pass under a critical analysis to be more, to be well thinked. So we have these two ongoing problems here. One that specifically intersectionality is not something that it's mentioned in direct mode, but I think this is something that it's present. It's present because it's present in the critique of the subject in general. It's present because we have to think about all the ways and all the forms that discourses and power practices, they can build subjectivities, they can build identities, they can build all these ways and forms of life. And we have to look at their categorical limits, but we also have to look what these categorical limits establish as ways of living and acting. And this made us look at this movement that put in distance these different spaces of life. So if intersectionality thinks about these different spaces, these different conditions that have to be brought about in matter of our analysis, I think this is present. I don't know if I can go further here because I'm thinking and translating all at the same time, but I think that although it's not something that is, not that it's not mentioned, she mentions it, but it's not, let me say it, it's not a concept that she put in her problems, but I think that what means intersectionality is present, and it's very present in Butler's work.
Okay, thank you, Ângela. Can we go to Sonia or Elsie?
Answer will be very quick, I think. I have some information on this, and it was still, things started to help, very positive impact in the community as well. We know that we need to have operational units in research, and our research was, we had a time to finish, a time limit to finish and to produce publications, as is the case everywhere. And so, and our operational unit was the secondary school setting in agrarian reform. But there was such a ferment of good ideas and good material and everything that in our follow-up in 2019, that was very brief, students mentioned, and it's part of their statements in a number of collections of data that we have. They said that things were beginning to change in the family, not only in relation to the banning initially of any topics related to homosexuality, etc., but there was a huge change in the families as well. and we wish we had the funding to do this and to interact more with the social movements and the teachers as well. The social movements, they came to our last seminar, and it was a very interesting presentation because things began to intersect. One difficulty that we had was not in the least ideological. It was funding, the requirements of funding that we have to fulfill what the funding was provided, and an immense load of publications, etc., that are coming. A book of mine has just come out on this, a joint article by Sonia and myself, they are coming out, etc. So, and it would have been so good to have used the momentum that was gained and to go into the community as a whole, even if we could not go into so many communities, but it would have been so good if we could do it. And there were two other very positive findings, not systematically studied as well. And again, I talk about funding. I wish we could have had the chance to do it. That was the statements by those postgraduate students that you mentioned. So institutionalizing social movements and minorities, etc., as part of the graduate program. And the work that the students are doing now, Mariana and a number of them, that they are doing now, going to different settlements, because we use mostly 2 settlements. In Rio Bonito do Iguaçu, and another one in Lapa, but Lapa Contestado. Sometimes the names are a bit confusing, but the fact is that we received an invitation to go to another one, Ortigueiras, and we started to do it there. And it was upon the request of one of the teachers who had participated in it. And so it was the beginning of another one. It's a process. We cannot say that things happen between 2015 and 2018. It's a process. And now it started to generate positive results. When I received the MA dissertations and the abstracts and everything, I was so pleased to see that those young they were undergraduate students at the time, right, Sonia? They were undergraduate students who followed us, who were fascinated by, like Sonia and myself, they were fascinated about what was going on, and the response that we received from the teachers, headmasters, and students mostly. And so they went into an MA and carried on in their graduate studies, and they focused on this and branched out to different settlements. So perhaps we could, using a bit of the Brazilian terminology, talk of it as the multiplying effect. So this was very, very positive as well, and other settlements asking us whether we could go and do the same there. What we face now is the question of funding, and because you finish a project and you have to present the outputs, you presented it, but then it would begin another one. One methodological difficulty that I would say was to see how it impacted students' lives. They said that things had changed, that their families became more open. The headmasters also say that when they had meetings with the parents, that the parents were a bit, reserved about this project at first, that they understood that this was necessary. And the students talking, having the freedom to talk about this at home, because at first the topic of homosexuality was banned. So it was, I think it was very interesting and very good, etc. What I wish we could do was perhaps to go back and try to trace those students and also the teachers who participated. The problem is that the teachers, we tried to locate the teachers, how this played out in their teaching, in everyday life, etc. But that most of the teachers, they are in precarious contract. So they work in an institution for 1 year. So it's this neoliberal fragmentation that people thinks it's not that the ideas that were planted did not have continuity. It's just because there is so much fragmentation, and people work in one place and then they work in a totally different one, and we lose track of them. So this is where it's a little bit difficult to judge what happened. And also, I think that I still think that the major issue is funding, because it would have been so good to carry on. And the achievements such as interaction with the social movements, etc., if we could have carried forward what was there, and especially those dissenting voices like ours, like the voices of the social movements, they are necessary dissenting voices when we have this radicalization of conservatism in Brazil, and a total disregard for the achievements of knowledge, of thinkers, and social development as well. People who also respond to those changes and to emancipation, etc. So would you agree with me, Sonia, that it's mostly funding that we need to try to see what happened?
Yes, yes, Elsie. I think I agree with you. And I would like to start my this question to respond to the question that Maria Rita made to me. I think an important question, and with what you already you were talking. Funding, I think, was something very important for us to continue like a project like this one. But I think also, I think the contest in Brazil was
intimidating.
Yeah, we felt that it was like a bit risky for teachers, for us to teach them how to work with gender diversity, all those this. This was a kind of risk for them, even though many of them take this risk, because they were criminalized in Brazil because of all this.
Gag law.
Yeah.
Lei da mordança.
Yeah, and then I think this is something that is very important to mention. It was the beginning when I started to think about this comparison study, because when I lived in UK during my PhD with Elsie from 2008 to 2013, but that time I didn't study the education system in UK. And I was not thinking about this at that time. I was working with rural issues and education and gender related issues. And because all the backlash we will have here in Brazil, I was seeing that in UK, they were going in a different direction, because they were just at the same time making compulsory this education guidance, which is also related to the law that they have, the gender equality law from 2010. But they have guidance before of this, but it was not compulsory for schools. And then many schools who don't think this is important, or don't think who don't agree with this, they didn't teach about same-sex relationships and gender diversity in general. And what I think that it's just to say, answer what Maria Rita asked me about the difference also. I think that at the end of the last century, UK was going on all this backlash with Thatcher and the Thatcher government in terms of the neoliberal policy that was implemented at that time in UK, but also in terms of gender, and it has a huge impact in education. All these 28 section that it was prohibited to discuss gender diversity at schools. But what I think that what happens, even though in UK that there is now a conservative government, but this is different, this kind of conservative government that we have in Brazil, in terms of, because this is this connection with what they call British values, and all this, this is more an open society, in terms of having these equality laws, which includes gender issues. I think this is something very important, because they consider all these Equality Act that they have in 2000. This is law, and this is also for the government. And I think this was very important for the government, even a conservative government, to issue this guidance nowadays. And even though we can say we have some religions that we started this all this movement against the implementation of the relationships and sex education guidance, we can say that these were not all, it was Muslims, communities, Jews, and then also Christians, but it was more like the Church of England is in this relations more progressive in UK than at least part.
But still, they don't
Catholic
celebrate weddings, right? But still, the Church of England that is more progressive in this respect, and there is no dissociation between the church and the state
Yes.
here in the UK. So, for example, they pioneered in divorce, etc. But the Church of England, to my knowledge, respects but will not celebrate gay weddings. Am
Yes.
I correct, Sonia? You
Yes,
have
yes, you are correct. Yes, but they respect this, and they agree that it should be taught at schools. But also they because of religions, it said in the guidance that religions beliefs must also be respected at schools, and they need to teach according to the religion's belief, but they need to teach a different belief than the one of religions. I think this is something with like the Church of England are taking more seriously that other religions like the Muslims and I think part of the Catholic Church. And then I think because this is law, I think this is very important to be enforced at schools, because we don't have this law here. We can say in Brazil that this should enforce that we can, and we have all this backlash in Brazil. And there I think it was the beginning of a backlash. But it was motivated also by all the campaigners across the different countries, because this is something that people, teachers, also parents, they receive like emails in WhatsApp, like saying all these some lies about what what people were teaching at schools and so on. And this was related to campaigners who they tried to also to promote this more conservative agenda, but I think they were minority in terms of the of people who are more related to implement this agenda in the parliamentary. Because I also, something was very important for me was listening to all the parliamentary debates. Then we could see even some people who were more, who were related to the conservative government, they were kind of open to this inclusion of to this for this guidance become compulsory. Not like progressive parliamentarians, but they were kind of open. But there were also people related to the more conservative agenda who tried to stop the implementation of this guidance before it became law. Something that I would like to highlight. I don't know if
Maria Rita, whether we can make generalizations in this. It's very new, etc. But we see different responses in different places, such as in this equality law. Looking here at the university, we see some visible signs that gender diversity, equality is being taken into account. For example, in the library, there is a sequence of bathrooms, one for men, one for transgenders, and another one for women. So it's a visible architectural sign that they are taking this very seriously. But there are pockets of conservatism in the country, or I don't know whether we can label it being very conservative, but it's very much part of their beliefs, such as the Muslims, to my knowledge. Sonia studied this in greater detail. For them, homosexuality does not exist.
It is a sin. It's even a sin.
Yeah, it's a sin. It does not exist. So the law, let's say, will not exist for them because it presupposes the existence of homosexuality. And I remember on TV those very strong reactions in Birmingham that Sonia presented. But in other places, it's very, very simple. It moves easily. I think it's so difficult to generalize. I don't know. I think that it's an uneven process where the differences are more noted in some places than the others. But most cases, I think that the research we carried out and that there is a continuation in Sonia's present research, it tends to show that there are strong generational differences, right? This, I think it's very clear, right, Sonia?
Yes.
The younger generations, they are much more open. They responded very much. And this is something that the knowledge we acquired from those adolescents, they emphasized a lot, that it was the huge difference in response within their families, gradually changing. Now they accept more. They can talk about homosexuality in the house. They started to talk about my brother is a homosexual, right, Sonia? But yes. The taboo subject was not, no, for the students, it was no longer a taboo. but especially they were very political in their defense of the right to sexual orientation, whatever it was. But it's very complicated. It's a very complex issue for which I think there are no easy answers. But I wish we could have the funding to continue looking at, including this intimidating atmosphere. In one of our seminars with the teachers, a lawyer, it's from the Federal University of Paraná. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name now, but he gave—
Ricardo Pazello.
Yeah, he gave an excellent presentation on this, on the impact of the Lei da Mordaça, the impact that had, because that gives the right to families to point a finger at those teachers who are teaching those topics. So they introduce a sense of Foucaultian surveillance on the topic. Well, and people need to work, they need to preserve their workplace, etc. So what do they do? Even if internally they want to be more open and contribute, but what happens if the parents will, there is a term that he used, I don't remember now, but it's what if parents begin to denounce? Yes, they denounce it to the authorities. And one other thing that makes me think that different reactions, that they are uneven and there will be localized different reactions, is that what he explained about the gag law, that it initiated in Congress, but that whether or not to subscribe to it is the decision of municipalities. So it may— let's suppose that we have an open-minded mayor who will not care about it, but there are others who take great pride in saying that they will not accept such discourses.
I would like just to add something that what Elsie said about the openness about LGBT issues in Brazil, in the countryside that we have worked in the settlements. It's also related yes, to all these social movements changes, like the MST in Brazil, who already since 2015 have has a LGBT collective called landless LGBT. Yeah, they are the LGBT sem terra, and they and this is very important for people in the countryside. Change to be more open also to these changes in society and to teaching at schools. Yeah, to what we could see at the countryside schools was all this the impact of our project, but also the impact of what already has been developed inside the social movements. And yeah, I could see also this through the dissertation that I oriented of Aguinaldo Cordeiro. Maria Rita was part of the examiners, yeah, and he discussed the inclusion of LGBT issues at the MST, yeah, and also how it happens, and in our research we could see also the importance of this, because students were in one school, especially in Araci Salete Strozaski. They were more open to discuss LGBT issues, and they have, even at school, they have a collective of LGBT Sem Terra. It was a bit different than in the other school.
Yes, yes, we noticed that, Sonia. We talked about that, the difference between the schools in those settlements and the schools, the regular schools in Brazil, especially the state of Paraná. Well, I think
It's going to be on the time.
So yeah, but it was a great conversation, a great talk after the wonderful presentation. And I would like to thank you very much. I don't know if André wants to talk to Ângela a little bit more, or just to thank you all for being here this morning and afternoon in UK. Well, if not, we're going to end this section, and thank you once more, and hope that we continue our conversation and our research and our exchange in research. It was very nice talking to you, Elsie.
Great. And Maria Rita, if I can jump in a second, border crossing permitting, I will be in Brazil from Christmas onwards on research leave. And perhaps I could take a few days to go to Paraná for us to think of sustainability. I like the top of the conference, sustainability. And as mentioned, I think the major problem is funding. But we have learned in our lives to play acrobatics to get funding. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Part of our skills.
Yeah, we have acrobatics skills to get funding. There's a little bit from Fatima, there's a little bit from a British Academy, but it ends up working in the end. Okay.
It was very nice. It's going to be very nice to have you here, maybe presently here in Curitiba, and Sonia and I can arrange for you.
Oh, with great pleasure. Okay.
Yes.
That's what's going to happen next in the pandemic world.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank
And we see you the next time. Ângela?
Okay. Thank you very much. Good to see you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye then.
Okay, bye-bye.
you. It was a pleasure to be with you all.